Opening the center, the queen's pawn immediately contests central space and prepares for rapid development. Establishing central pawn presence mirrors white's intent, promising an engaging battle for board control. Challenging the center immediately, this opens diagonals and creates dynamic central pawn tension. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the queenside knight paves the way for queenside expansion. Developing a knight to its most natural square, this move aims to support the central pawn structure and prepare for castling, hinting at a solid and principled opening approach. Developing the knight to a central square, the king's knight aims to reinforce d5 and prepare for queenside expansion, typical of the Slav defense's solid structure. Solidifying the center's pawn structure and preparing for further development, white asserts control while keeping options open. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop, this move opens lines for future play while creating a robust pawn structure. Establishing influence on the d-pawn's defense, this bishop aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially free white's queenside. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance proactively seeks to disrupt white's bishop on g5 development, aiming for a freer pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop here trades off black's key defender of the dark squares, potentially opening avenues for future piece pressure. It signals an intention to exploit the weakened pawn structure and may lead to a more dynamic middle game where white aims for rapid development and active piece play. Reclaiming the queen immediately solidifies black's center and aims to develop the remaining minor pieces, though the doubled pawns on the f-file create a slight long-term structural weakness that will need careful management to avoid being exploited. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling offers a safe, structural foundation, albeit at the cost of some immediate dynamism. White opts for a gradual buildup, prioritizing pawn chain integrity and piece harmony over aggressive pawn thrusts, aiming for a long-term positional advantage. Developing the kingside pawn structure further, this maneuver aims to eventually fianchetto the dark-squared bishop, reinforcing the center and preparing for potential castling into a more protected sanctuary, although it does create a slight weakness on the dark squares around the king. Repositioning the bishop to a more passive square on the kingside, b2 quietly prepares for kingside castling, aiming to tuck the king away safely from the open d-file. This move also allows the rook on f1 to potentially swing over to the kingside, supporting the king and perhaps even participating in a future attack. White prioritizes development and king safety over immediate pawn advances, seeking a solid foundation for the middle game. Developing the knight to d7 reinforces the central pawn chain and prepares to castle kingside, a logical step in solidifying black's position after the earlier queen maneuver. Securing the monarch is paramount. Launching this castling maneuver effectively tucks the king behind a fortified pawn structure, preparing for future middle game confrontations and potential threats. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal prepares it for an active role, eyeing the kingside and potentially supporting a future kingside attack or defense, while also connecting the rooks for unified action. Unleashing central ambition, this bold pawn push instantly seizes the initiative, cramping black's space and creating dynamic imbalances. Black embraces an immediate pawn exchange, accepting the central simplification and opening a diagonal for their queen. This decision aims to alleviate some of white's central pressure while potentially creating opportunities for queenside counterplay. Asserting central dominance, the knight boldly advances to occupy the vital e4 square, challenging black's pawn structure and opening avenues for further piece development. Instantly, the queen becomes a beacon of activity, but simultaneously anchors itself precariously near enemy lines. Sharpening the central pressure, the queen's repositioning now eyes the kingside diagonal and prepares to bolster the knight's advance while potentially untangling the piece coordination for a kingside assault. Unleashing the pawn's aggressive intent, black immediately challenges white's knight, aiming to disrupt the central pawn structure and potentially open lines for future play, although it does leave the king's diagonal somewhat exposed. Fortifying the knight's central outpost while preparing a potential kingside advance opens up a more aggressive middle game for white. Black boldly confronts the central pawn structure, injecting immediate dynamic tension by challenging white's e4 pawn and aiming to pry open the c-file for potential piece activity. This maneuver thoughtfully aims to bolster white's queenside pawns and potentially create an outpost for the knight on f3, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the central pawn structure with a future d5 push. Shifting the queen to c7 prepares to challenge the d-file and simultaneously protects the b7 pawn, creating a flexible defensive and offensive posture. Unlocking the central tension, white boldly advances the d-pawn, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and seize control of the newly opened diagonals. This aggressive thrust demands a precise response, as it forces black to confront the immediate threat of pawn capture and potential space advantage for white. The ensuing exchange or retreat will fundamentally alter the pawn landscape and dictate the strategic direction for the coming moves. Securing the king with a castling maneuver initiates a crucial defensive consolidation, addressing the previously exposed royal position amidst white's encroaching central pawn structure. Unlocking the d-file offers immediate attacking prospects, directly challenging black's king's safety and potentially opening lines for white's rook. The knight's retreat to f6 solidifies the center and prepares to contest the open d-file, but it also surrenders the d5 square, a key outpost for white's ambitious pawn push, and leaves the e4 pawn somewhat isolated. Seeking to exploit the open d-file and create attacking chances against black's king, the knight ventures to the edge, preparing to jump into g6 or f5, though this outpost at h4 might prove a temporary static position if black can quickly consolidate. The king's journey to safety, establishing a haven behind the g-pawn, is a wise defensive maneuver. This retreat not only shields the monarch from potential immediate threats, but also prepares for a more robust defensive structure, allowing black to consolidate forces and contemplate future counterplay, perhaps targeting that advanced d5 pawn or looking to activate pieces on the queen side. Unlocking the king side with this piece repositioning aims to solidify white's central presence and prepare for potential pawn pushes, while simultaneously creating a more harmonious setup for the queenside battery. Black finally resolves the doubled pawns on the king side, liberating the knight and creating a more harmonious pawn structure, while simultaneously challenging white's central control and opening a diagonal for the bishop towards the king side. The rook slides into the center, seizing the only open file and preparing for a potential advance on the king's defense, while simultaneously reinforcing the knight's advanced outposts and creating a formidable battery along the e-file, a truly proactive stance that immediately challenges black's somewhat passive pawn structure. Shifting the bishop to the flank aims to improve its scope and potentially eye the queen side, though it risks neglecting central control and inviting pawn advances against the king. Focusing the knight on the king side aims to exploit the slightly exposed black monarch, potentially orchestrating a mating attack by bringing more pieces into the assault, while simultaneously preparing to contest the central files more effectively. Reclaiming the central file is a priority after the exchange, as black seeks to activate their rook and challenge white's pawn structure, aiming to contest open lines and prepare for potential pawn breaks. Hoping to reroute that knight to a more active square, perhaps the f4 outpost, while simultaneously reinforcing its central presence. Unblocking the queen and preparing to bring the knight back into the game via f6 presents a logical repositioning, aiming to solidify the pawn structure and potentially contest the e-file. The knight makes a swift redeployment, aiming to reinforce the central dark squares and prepare for a potential advance on the king side, creating an imposing knight outpost. Finally, black repositions a knight to a more active square, seeking to exploit the open central files and potentially threaten white's king. Liberating the knight from its central entanglement opens the d-file, aiming to activate the rook and contest its occupation. This decision sacrifices a pawn's positional integrity for dynamic piece play, seeking to exploit black's somewhat passive development. Observe how this knight's relocation alters the pressure points on the board, potentially creating weaknesses around black's king. The board's geometry shifts with this exchange, and white now eyes the possibility of a queenside initiative should black not react precisely. Reclaiming the e-file is a sensible step, bringing the rook into a more active role and directly challenging white's central presence. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially open lines for counterplay. A crucial defensive posture given black's somewhat passive pawn structure on the queen side and the exposed nature of the king side. Exchanges on the central e-file, strategically simplifying and aiming to pressure black's slightly awkward knight development with an eye towards potential pawn breaks. With the exchange of queens, the board opens up, and the rook on e5 now directly eyes the weak pawn on g2. A consequence of white's earlier pawn advances, creating structural vulnerabilities. The pawn on b3 stabilizes the queen side, preparing to potentially advance on the c-file or support a future a4 push, while also creating a safe square for the bishop on c1 if needed for a repositioning. A subtle but important defensive maneuver as the pieces rearrange. Black repositions the rook to the open e-file, challenging white's central influence and preparing for potential piece exchanges that could simplify the position towards an endgame where black's queen might find more activity. Securing a vital foothold on the kingside, the pawn advance aims to restrict black's queenside piece mobility and potentially initiate a dangerous pawn storm. Creating a defensive pawn wall at h5, black reinforces the kingside, albeit at the cost of potential backwardness on the g-file and a slight weakening of the kingside pawn structure as a whole, while simultaneously blocking the immediate threat of the knight's advance and opening a new pathway for the h-pawn to potentially support central advances later if needed. Suddenly, the queens are off the board, shifting focus to the pawn structure and potential long-term advantages in the center. Exchanging queens now simplifies the position dramatically, transitioning towards an endgame where black's slightly more active rook on the open file and the potential for pawn breaks could become significant, though white's central pawn structure remains solid. Simplifying to a pawn-up endgame, white aims to leverage their extra material and active pieces. Here's a detailed analysis. The position asterisk. After black's 27, qxc2, we've reached a critical juncture. White has just played 28, bxc2. White's goals asterisk. Material advantage, asterisk. White is up a pawn. The primary objective now is to convert this advantage into a win. Piece activity, asterisk. While the position is simplifying, white wants to maintain as much piece activity as possible to pressure black's remaining pieces. King safety, asterisk. With queens off the board, king's safety becomes paramount. White's king is currently well protected, and they will want to keep it that way. Pawn structure, asterisk. White wants to avoid creating weaknesses in their own pawn structure, while aiming to exploit any black weaknesses. Black's challenges, asterisk. Material deficit, asterisk. Black is a pawn down and must find ways to create counterplay or complications to compensate. Passive pieces. Some of black's pieces might become somewhat passive in the endgame if not handled carefully. Asterisk. Exploiting imbalances, asterisk. Black needs to look for ways to create tactical opportunities or activate their pieces to challenge white's advantage. Analysis of 28, bxc2. This move is fundamentally about simplification and material realization. By exchanging the bishop for the queen, white eliminates black's most powerful attacking piece. This is a logical step when you are ahead in material, as it reduces the complexity of the position and makes it easier to convert the advantage. Key considerations for white, asterisk. Pawn pushes, asterisk. White will likely look to advance their queenside pawns to create passed pawns. Rook activity, asterisk. The rooks will become very important in the endgame. White should aim to place them on open files or behind their passed pawns. Knight maneuvers, asterisk. The knight is a flexible piece in the endgame. White can use it to support pawn advances or infiltrate black's position. Key considerations for black, asterisk. Blockade, asterisk. Black might try to blockade white's pawns to prevent them from advancing. Counterplay, asterisk. Black will need to look for opportunities to create counterplay, perhaps by attacking white's king or creating passed pawns of their own. Piece coordination, Asterisk Black's remaining pieces will need to work together effectively to create threats. Overall asterisk. This is a prudent move by White. They are simplifying into an endgame where their material advantage is most likely to be decisive. The game now becomes a test of endgame technique. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this advance aims to establish a robust defensive perimeter and potentially activate the queenside majority for future counterplay. Anchoring the bishop here prepares for a potential advance of the central pawns, aiming to create a strong pawn chain and open lines for attack. A courageous pawn sacrifice to activate the bishop, aiming to disrupt White's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for Black's rook on the e-file. Confronting the rook on the open file, a decisive assertion of influence over the central territory, aims to neutralize Black's recent pawn advances and restrict the bishop's scope. The king sidesteps a potential knight fork, securing its safety while preparing to rejoin the battle on the kingside. Solidifying the king's position is paramount as the position simplifies, preventing any unexpected checks or forced lines that could destabilize the monarch. Repositioning the rook from the contested central file, Black seeks to untangle its forces and prepare a potential counterplay along the kingside, aiming to activate the piece for future strategic objectives. Shifting the rook across the board aims to contest the open file, a vital step in preparing for potential pawn breakthroughs or piece exchanges that could favor White in the ensuing endgame. The Black king ventures out, a bold move seeking to become an active participant in the endgame, but it also exposes itself to potential dangers from White's centralized pieces, particularly the rook on d2. Shifting the rook to the second rank clears the way for potential pawn advancements and reinforces control over the central files, a prudent measure given the bishop's current activity. Exchanging rooks here willingly surrenders the open e-file and inaugurates a simpler endgame where Black's active bishop on d4 will be a significant advantage. Transitioning to a rook endgame, this capture simplifies the material and aims to exploit the slightly awkward placement of Black's remaining pieces, particularly the bishop currently on d4, which is somewhat exposed. Bringing the king to the center now opens up active possibilities, seeking shelter from enemy threats while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances or even a daring central infiltration, showcasing an endgame approach where the monarch transforms into a fighting piece. Unlocking the d-file is the immediate objective, aiming to exploit the weakness of Black's isolated pawn and potential king safety issues down that open highway. The bishop's journey to c3 now aims to occupy a crucial diagonal, potentially disrupting White's pawn structure and creating counterplay. Asserting control over the crucial dark squares, the bishop on d5 aims to restrict Black's already passive pieces and prepare for further central expansion. Shifting the bishop to the edge of the action reevaluates the central control, preparing to contest the open files and potentially pressure White's queenside pawns. Initiating queenside expansion with this pawn push aims to gain crucial space and prepare for potential pawn storms or to create weaknesses in Black's structure. Relocating the bishop to the open diagonal unlocks long-term pressure and potentially creates entry points for future piece activity. Activating the knight to square 2 offers a vital defensive pivot, potentially rerouting the piece to pressure Black's bishop on d2 or to bolster the kingside should further complications arise. Unleashing the pawns forward thrust now attempts to pry open the center and exploit White's slightly disorganized minor pieces, aiming to create attacking chances on the kingside before White can solidify. Reclaiming the initiated pawn push, the knight retreats to a more central defensive posture, prioritizing the safety of its own king over aggressive incursions, thereby settling the position into a less dynamic, more methodical struggle where material advantage might become a decider. The Black king, now an active participant, ventures deep into White's territory, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop and perhaps disrupt White's pawn structure. Unleashing a check, the knight pivots to the center, threatening to dismantle Black's pawn chain and open lines towards the exposed king. The Black king, now quite forward, forces a crucial decision regarding the development of white's remaining pieces. Capturing the pawn unlocks a protected passed pawn on the queen side, potentially forcing crucial exchanges to simplify into a winning endgame. Seizing the initiative by snatching the unprotected pawn opens a dynamic path for black, initiating a crucial endgame phase where piece activity will outweigh material equality, forcing white to confront an increasingly awkward pawn structure. Unlocking the G-file for potential pawn storms becomes a primary objective now that the dark-squared bishop is gone. Bringing the king to the forefront of this endgame offers an aggressive counterplay, aiming to challenge white's centralized pawn structure before it solidifies further. Focusing on the open diagonals, this piece repositions to eye the vulnerable dark squares around black's king, seeking to exploit any weakness as the game simplifies towards its endgame conclusion. Seizing the initiative, black's king bravely ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate its own limited forces. Unleashing the f-pawn ignites a fierce battle for queenside territory, aiming to create a passed pawn that demands immediate attention and might just decide the endgame. The pawn push on the G-file drastically alters the defensive structure around black's now exposed king, creating a tactical minefield that was previously contained. Now that white has eliminated the troublesome black pawn on f4 with bxf5, the immediate threat is gone, allowing for a repositioning of white's forces to exploit the open files. The bishop, having completed its defensive duty, can now swing over to support an advance on the king side or simply to achieve a more active diagonal. Snatching that pawn on a4 is a bold, aggressive decision, forcing the white king to retreat and potentially creating a decisive passed pawn for black. Seizing the open file with the bishop offers a glimpse of initiative, but it allows black to solidify their pawn structure and potentially target white's exposed king. Initiating a pawn advance on the queen side to disrupt white's coordinated piece play and contest the open files, aiming to create counterplay. Unlocking the king's influence on the board, pushing the pawn forward initiates a critical endgame struggle for central dominion. Reclaiming the initiative after a series of exchanges, black's monarch bravely ventures out, seeking active participation in this decisive phase of the game.